Hello, and welcome back to GMF Talk, where we get perspectives from around the world on the most pressing media issues today. I'm Sertan Sanderson, and I'm excited to welcome Professor Charlie Beckett today, with whom I will be discussing an issue that truly affects all journalists, and that is the ways in which we make money. Professor Beckett is the founding director of Polis, a think tank focusing on international journalism at the Department of Media and Communications at London School of Economics. He has researched the future of journalism extensively and is an expert in, among many, many other things, media economics. Thank you for joining us today, Professor Beckett.
Hi there, thanks.
Hi. Now, before we dive deeper into revenue models themselves, I would like to briefly talk about one of your fields of interest and research, and that is the role of artificial intelligence in the future of journalism. Now, AI is already being rolled out in all kinds of industries around the world as a cost-saving measure. I would like to ask you, as someone myself who is making money as a journalist, do you think that we will all somehow be replaced by AI someday? Is that part of the future business model of journalism? And does that mean that I should perhaps be looking for another career path?
Well, I think your job's safe, certain, partly because you're a human being who's got judgment and character and empathy. And the paradox of this new set of technologies, AI, in journalism at least, is that it might actually mean we value the human element even more. The idea with AI, when we talk to newsrooms around the world, is not that they want to get rid of the great journalists. It's to help the journalists. It's the AI, the machine learning, the automation, that can do the boring stuff, or it can do the complex tasks at scale. But generally speaking, it's not going to replace, the critical judgment and the creativity. The hope is it gives more room for that, and because that's the bit that makes a difference. When people choose a journalist brand, they do it because of trust and judgment, not just efficiency. So we hope that AI can help with journalistic efficiency, although it's complex, it's quite difficult to implement. Perhaps it's actually at the other end, the marketing and the distribution of journalism, where AI might save money or at least make money by making it more effective, connecting better, to customers.
You mentioned distribution there, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But as we dive deeper into the idea of the business model, many news organizations have changed in the last decade or so. They're reflecting the heavy digitization drive that is permeating truly every aspect of our lives these days. And in the past, news and information sources were typically paid for at the point of purchase, whether this meant picking up a newspaper at a newsstand or sitting through ad breaks during a TV program. And today there are paywalls, subscription services, voluntary donations, and yet again ads. So are the revenue models of the digital age fundamentally different from those of the past? Or are we talking kind of about the same thing, really?
Well, there is a fundamental difference. There is much more variety, as you just mentioned, in the business models. In the past, there were effectively three. You either paid directly for your newspaper, for example, or, as with Deutsche Welle, it's funded through taxation, like the BBC, or it was funded through advertising. There was this magical thing where advertising was in the news media and it paid for the journalism. The advertising hasn't disappeared, but there's much less of it. And so what's happened is that the news media realizes when it goes online, when it becomes digital, when it's part of social media especially, it's not competing anymore amongst themselves. They're actually competing with all the other things that get people's attention and their advertising attention and even, their money, full stop. So it's a completely different marketplace. And as you say, the news organizations have had to respond by coming up with new business models.
You mentioned the buzzword there that I was looking for, social media. So there's a growing imbalance between news sources that are available for free, especially online, and those that do charge for their content. Now, what kind of dangers does that pose globally, really, when it comes to providing access to unbiased quality news versus content that is perhaps freely and readily available, but might be driven by a hidden agenda, such as, let's say, nationalist propaganda?
Well, I think propaganda has always been a problem. There's nothing new about that. But I think you do identify a potential problem, at least, which is quite rightly, news organizations have decided to focus on audiences who value their work enough to pay for it, because at the end of the day, somebody has to pay for it. And therefore, you've seen a growth in subscription services, paywalls, membership organizations, even. And that does mean that in the future, increasingly, especially the best journalism that isn't funded by taxation will be behind paywalls. At the moment, I just don't think that's a problem. At the moment, there's still a lot of open journalism, and journalism is relatively cheap. And most of those paywalls are quite varied. You can get access to some articles some of the time. But I think there is a bigger issue, which is perhaps not at the quality end, it's at the popular end. We used to get, people who aren't particularly interested in news would still get their political information, their economic information through, for example, the tabloid or popular press or popular broadcasters. And increasingly that's being separated out. The entertainment is provided without that sort of healthy politics. And that, I think, is an issue, that the wider demographic of people who aren't news obsessives like you and me, where are they going to get enough information to keep them interested?
Okay, now there's a word I want to throw out there that many journalists consider a bit dirty: content. People are becoming more and more used to consuming content, especially on social media. Now, at face value, social media platforms are for free. Of course, we all pay for them with our personal data, but there's no obvious monetary transaction involved in joining and partaking in social media channels. Has this created some kind of expectation in people that content shared by news organizations on social media should also be for free? And how can newsmakers still monetize their content in this environment?
Well, this is part of the whole shift that basically journalists used to think, when I was working in a newsroom, we kind of owned the news. We were the gatekeepers. No one else made the news. No one else gave people information or commentary or analysis. We did that job. Unfortunately, everyone does it, and they often do it very well. You have universities who do direct broadcasting online, and there's nothing wrong with that. So journalists don't own the news anymore. And that means that when you want to persuade people to come to you, you have to give them something extra. You have to do the things you're supposed to do, which is, accuracy and reliability and so on. But you now have to stand out. You have to have value. And you also have to build a relationship. In the past, we didn't really worry about that. People came to us, they watched our programs or read our newspapers. We didn't pay much attention. But on social media especially, you have to build a relationship. You have to understand why people use the news in the first place. They have no duty to, it's not obligatory. So you have to listen to them and talk to them. And in fact, social media is a pretty good way to do that, to build that relationship. And in the end, you hope, to deliver the kind of journalism that they will value enough to perhaps subscribe to or pay for or support the taxes that pay for it.
So if we're no longer the gatekeepers, if we're no longer, that fourth estate, is that a good thing for democracy? If we democratize the process of people checking in on those that are accountable to them? Or is it a bad thing? Should there be a separate estate, a separate realm set aside to check in on our decision makers, our politicians, our parliamentary processes?
Well, the good news is the fourth estate hasn't gone away. The news media, despite all the problems and challenges it's facing, is actually pretty robust. And a lot of the commentary you will see on social media or the conversation is still driven by the news media. So there's still a lot of power there, but it's not automatic and it's not deferential. And I think broadly that's a good thing. It's not just that individuals can speak out and contribute to the information world, but a whole bunch of experts and also politicians can now speak directly. Now, you may not like it when Donald Trump goes on Twitter, but it's not bad for people who support him. They love it. They like the idea that he is speaking directly to them. And so, of course, like any technology that brings change, of course, there's going to be good and bad. But that's not innate to the technology. It's not the technology that's moral, that is more democratic or less. It's what we do with it. And I think if we have got a lot of political problems in the world, they're caused by economic and social forces and trends rather than social media. It's not Facebook that makes the world democratic or not.
You mentioned morals there. Is that an extension of what we should be thinking about, the ethics of journalism, having an update perhaps, or the way that we approach people on social media? Should we have a reckoning with ourselves as journalists and rethink our role in society?
Yeah, I think you're making a good point, and it's, it sounds like a big philosophical question, but actually it's quite a practical question. It's just that in the past, journalists were very ethical, but without even thinking about it really. We kind of assumed that there was a right way to do it, and it depended on what kind of news organization you were. There were some very naughty journalists in the past. There were some very immoral news organizations that might have done bad things. So yes, we shouldn't throw away traditional values like accuracy and reliability and accountability. But you're right, we do have to reinvent them. We have to be a bit more humble. We have to pay much more attention to the impact that our work has. How we go around blaming bad, fake news and terrible people on the internet. And we don't perhaps pay enough attention to our own role and our own influence on events and issues.
So some self-reflection to do there for all of us. I have one last question, and it's a generic one. What are some of the revenue models for media outlets that you believe are future-proof, at least to a certain extent?
None are future-proof. The model we had until recently wasn't eternal. It evolved in the mid-20th century. So we should expect there always to be change. Anyone who's in business knows that business models change for all sorts of reasons. As you said at the beginning of this conversation, there's a whole variety at the moment, all the way from memberships to taxation or indeed voluntary. There's a lot more philanthropy around news at the moment. And you can't choose one that's going to be the best. And indeed, any news organization, generally speaking, is looking to have various revenue streams. They don't want to just rely upon one model. And so we are seeing a real evolution. And I think it's a healthy thing, because I think it means that journalists are having to think, or news organizations are having to think about, well, why should anybody value our work anyway? It can't just be because we think we're great and we think that the journalism we produce is terrific and that somebody should support it. We have to justify what we do. And in that sense, the marketplace, if you like, is a way of us coming up with innovative ways. And I'm really impressed. Sometimes journalism has been a bit slow to be entrepreneurial, and there's good reasons for that. We're in here to do journalism. We're not generally here to make shed loads of money, but we need the money to do the journalism. And I think we're seeing it's going to be a struggle. We're heading for big economic storms anyway as a world. But I see lots of great signs of news organizations getting their act together and at least being more resilient. A lot of problems, especially in local news, for example. But generally speaking, I'm surprised that we haven't lost more journalism in the face of the intense competition.
Thank you for those optimistic words. And there you have it. Change is the name of the game. Thank you very much, Professor Charlie Beckett, for joining me from London today. And thank you for sharing all your insights with our global audience. And thank you for watching this episode of GMF Talk. We look forward to seeing you soon again. Until next time.